Welcome to another edition of Against the Current, coming to you from the Skyline Club atop the Old Republic building in downtown Chicago. I'm Dan Proft, host of Chicago's Morning Answer on AM 560, and my guest this week is Michael Lucci. He's the Vice President of Policy at the Illinois Policy Institute. Michael, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
So enough with the niceties. Let's get right down to it. You've looked at the data sets across every sector in Illinois, compared them to the Great Lakes, compared them to the nation, whether we're talking about K through 12 education, manufacturing job growth, in-migration versus out-migration, all of the alternative, the components of an alternative budget that Illinois Policy Institute proposed. Is there any reason for someone who does not need to stay in Illinois to stay in Illinois?
I think there are some good reasons. I think they focus on the neighborhood where we are right now, downtown Chicago. There are reasons that people are going to be moving to larger cities, talented people going to be moving to larger cities, being connected to O'Hare Airport to be able to get anywhere you want in the world very quickly. And I think that that is the wrong way to talk about it, because that is only caring about people who could do well wherever they end up in the United States or in the world. We want well-to-do, successful people here. But if you look at the other neighborhoods, these are the neighborhoods where people are leaving. If you look at the rest of the state, this is the part of the state where people are leaving, because for those people, there are not very good reasons to stick around unless you want to see, if you want to roll the dice on whether your home value is going to collapse here over the next couple of years, if you want to roll the dice whether your job's going to stay here, people don't like risk. And moving out of Illinois is one way to drop off a lot of risk to become in a less risky environment.
So you've done a lot of actually really interesting work on the in-migration, out-migration numbers, well beyond the annual United Van Line studies, where you dig below kind of the top line number of what's the aggregate number of people in versus number of people out. And so what's the story in Illinois? Because we continue to hear, and Illinois Policy Institute produces the data and the rationale to support it, that Illinois leads the nation, or is right there competitive with New Jersey for the last 5 years in people net leaving the state. So what's the real story? And to the extent that you can fill in that picture in terms of what it really means, what those numbers mean in terms of impact, and also is there, and not to give you a three-part question, but is there a consistent rationale that says if we address this, the people that have left, the productive people have left, would stay or would have stayed?
I think the story is every age group, every income bracket. That's where we lose people. We lose on net in every single age group and every single income bracket.
So this is not seniors who want to go someplace warm for their golden years, Florida, Arizona, or a no income tax state. That's not what's happening.
Oh, there's some of that.
Yeah,
there's some of
but
that.
that's not
sure.
exclusively. That's not
right.
the overarching explanation for what's happening.
And I think that the comparison you would make to look at these factors, because people will say it's the weather or it's retirees moving out. Well, we lose to every single state in the Midwest, states that have the same or worse weather than we have. So it's not the weather. And of course, states, retirees move from north to south. But if you look at states around us, you could see they have some of that. So you'll see Indiana will lose like 10,000 people on net per year. And that's probably about they're holding even, and then they're having retirees move out at the end of their careers. Illinois loses 114,000 people in a year. It's a very different story. If you say all states have the same population, Illinois' migration losses would be somewhere between 3 and 10 times worse than the states around us.
So 10,000 to 114,000, we're not 10 times the size,
right.
11 times the size of Indiana.
Right. So if we're all the same size, we would be by far the worst on out-migration. It's not just because we're a big state. It's not just retirees. The group leaving fastest is actually millennials. It's 34 and younger. That's the group that's getting out of state fastest, and that comes from working, folks who are working, and kids who are going to college. So we've been losing millennials on the college, this is through 2014. We've been losing millennials on college, about 14,000 per year. More move out than move in for college.
Because they're going to college out of state.
Out of state. So about 16,000 go to college out of state, 2,000 come from out of state in. This is for public colleges. So we've been a big loser of students, a brain drain.
And what is there any more contextual information on that? Because people would say, well, wait a second, we have good colleges. University of Illinois is one of the best engineering programs in the country. Yeah. Northwestern is a great school. DePaul is a good school. We've got good law schools here, good postgraduate schools as well. Why isn't that attracting the best and the brightest?
It certainly is, but a lot of the best and the brightest that are going to Illinois are coming from East Asia, and we want that to continue happening. But if you are an American, you're from around here, you could get a lot lower tuition going to some other states for a similar quality of school.
Go to Purdue for
You go to
engineering instead of
Purdue.
U of I.
And I think that, I mean, really, if you want to look at the story of migration, it's a Mitch Daniels story. He did all the things that you could do to make Indiana a state that Illinoisans would move to, and now he's doing it at the university level. He's keeping the tuition down at Purdue.
Froze it 5
froze
years
it.
running, I think.
And so now kids are going to go to college there from Illinois because it's going to be cheaper for them to go to college there. So all the things to attract business investment, job growth, low property taxes, the things that are driving people out of Illinois, Mitch Daniels got those all in line in Indiana. And so that's why we see the flow into Indiana is becoming a flood. The net loss in the most recent year was 20,000 people to Indiana. That's our big state that we lose to the most. And that will likely continue.
And so millennials, that helps in part to explain millennials. They go somewhere else for college, and then they stay somewhere else for their first job out of college. What about the other age demographics? Because you said it's across the board, up and down the income spectrum as well.
It is the groups that leave the fastest will be the millennials, then the next group up will be 35 to 44. They move out pretty quickly also. We do lose retirees, but the number is not huge on retirees. And there was a Paul Simon Institute poll that came out. They asked all these age brackets, do you want to leave, do you want to stay? Well, the working age group said they wanted to leave. Majorities wanted to leave. It was actually the retirees that said that they want to stay in Illinois. And to some extent, that makes sense because
Don't tax retirement income.
don't tax retirement income, your family's here. So if you're a grandparent, where do you want to be? Near the grandkids, near the kids. So as long as the family's staying here, they're going to want to stay here too.
But 35 to 44, so you're getting people starting to climb the ladder in their chosen profession, getting to their prime earning years when you get into your 40s in particular, and they want out. So what does that say about what they're saying about Illinois?
They're saying this isn't a place that's going to provide a good deal in terms of government. I think it's becoming clear to these folks, especially once they've had a home for 5, 10 years and they see what's happening on the property tax front, and then they look and they see what's happening in Springfield, which is, generally speaking, nothing good. So they're hemorrhaging money out of their home. Their home value is probably a little bit shaky because of the property taxes, because of the shrinking population. And they figure if that job opportunity comes up in another state, it would be worth really considering that because things don't look so certain in Illinois. As we move along this path of attempts to have reform that are thoroughly rejected by the majority party here, it makes people really think, is anybody going to turn this state around before the financial crisis really grows and becomes full-blown? And right now, it doesn't look like anybody it doesn't look like the legislature wants to work on something to turn around the state.
And are those people also looking at all of these kind of civilizing institutions that form the bedrock of a civilized society and saying, yeah, being out in the suburbs, there's some good schools and I got the kid in a good school. But I look over at some of other places that I think find comparable to living in suburban Chicago. And I see that there's schools that are performing just as well or better than the good school I have my kid in, and they're doing it for a fraction of the cost, both in terms of the actual out-of-pocket costs, property taxes, and kind of the overall state and local tax burden, as well as just kind of the costs of the transaction costs, the carrying costs, the quality of life costs of dealing with public sector unions and bureaucracy and layers of government. That you just see suburban communities around other major metropolitan areas, even in the Midwest, that just provide kind of, on net, a better deal.
Right. I think that is becoming the trend. And there's been recent studies that look at the out-migration from Cook. So Cook has always had out-migration, but what would happen was it would be people going to the collar counties. It's now less people going to the collar counties, and it's more people just leaving the state altogether as they get to that, mid-30s to get to their lower 40s where they're making these decisions about where kids are going to go to school, where they're going to make their longer-term home. they're opting out of Cook County altogether, and they're opting out of the state altogether, more so than they did in the past. And I think one of the really interesting stories is that after the Great Recession ended, our collar counties, which had forever been gainers on migration, because they've been gaining from Cook more than they lost the rest of the country, that's now upside down. All of the collar counties now lose more people than they gain, even though they continue to get these gains from people moving out to the suburbs from Cook. They're losing more to the rest of the country than they're gaining from Cook. And so they're actually seeing, I mean, McHenry County is shrinking. Other parts of the collar counties are shrinking, and these are the places that Illinoisans are supposed to move to when they leave the city of Chicago.
Well, especially as you get closer to border opportunities, right? What's the difference between living on one side of Cross Lake in Antioch versus the other side of Cross Lake in Trevor, Wisconsin? Mm-hmm. Well, the difference is nothing with respect to lifestyle, but significant with respect to kind of the bang for your buck, and it's better in Trevor, Wisconsin. And so people are looking across the border, seeing that. That's happening in the Quad Cities too.
I think that the Quad Cities are the best example of that, because the cities are literally the same. And I was out there a couple of years ago. You were out there too. You've got 2 Illinois cities, 2 Iowa cities, right, almost identical.
Right.
And if you look at the counties on the Illinois side, you have Rock Island County and you have Henry County. On the Iowa side, you have Scott County. Those make up the Quad Cities. The Illinois counties are shrinking every year, and the Iowa County, Scott County, is growing every year. It's literally people moving the width of the Mississippi River to go from the Illinois side to the Iowa side.
And they've got the same major employer. One of them
employer.
in John Deere. John Deere said we're not going anywhere. They're on the Illinois side, but well, I can still work for John Deere. I just be an Iowa resident and just, as you say, cross the Mississippi River to go to work.
And you look at housing starts across the border. Housing starts are much stronger on the other side of the border. That's across all of our borders. But it's almost like you don't want to be the last one out the door when you look at a situation like the Quad Cities, because you have to be able to sell your house to somebody if you're going to go buy a house on the other side of the river.
Right.
So that would be a growing concern. Is property taxes are very high in Illinois. Demand for homes, just by definition, is going down because our population is shrinking. And so you see a really good microcosm of that in the Quad Cities, because you have identical communities, one's shrinking, one's growing. But I think that that's a big story that's coming up, and I know that you've been talking about that a lot. By definition, demand for homes is going down in Illinois.
Well, some people are moving in. We have a lot of corporate campuses here throughout the Chicago metropolitan region. In other parts of the state, less so, but still some. So people get transferred here for work, or they move here for family, or some people actually do come and go to college here and they stay and get a job in Chicago, want to live in Chicago, all that. So do we have any sense of what the profile is on the person, kind of the median person leaving the state versus the median person coming, and kind of who is still coming to Illinois and who is leaving, and what's the net result of that?
Well, we have an economic profile for sure. The average person moving out makes about $77,000 per year. The average person moving in makes about $57,000. That differential is $20,000. That's the largest in the United States. Connecticut, it's a differential maybe $16,000 between the average moving out, the average moving in. So we have the economic profile. It's harder to say we gain people in every age group. We just lose more than we gain in every age group. So you could see the ins and the outs. It's just across the board we're losing on the trade-offs.
And so does that speak to the economic opportunities that Illinois presents? Because come to Illinois and make 55 grand, leave Illinois, you're making 75, and obviously you're probably not moving thinking you're going to take a haircut, thinking there's more upside potential somewhere else. I mean, is that sort of a canary in the coal mine that says lower market opportunities in Illinois, higher market opportunities where people are moving to?
Yes, and I think that something that should be considered, especially when we talk about manufacturing, the cost to move a facility is enormous.
Sure, the cost that you have in a facility.
The cost of moving your family is enormous.
Yeah.
Now, migration in general is very good. You want high migration across the country. This means we have dynamism. People are finding opportunities to move in around. You don't want to be in a place where you have migration largely just going in one direction and not flowing in, and that's where Illinois is. So Illinois' migration is very unhealthy. But the cost to move, it's not a comfortable thing to do, especially when you see that the age groups that leave, we do have a lot in the 35 to 44 and then 45 to 54. These are people with families. They have to pull kids out of school. They have to move them over there. It's easier in those millennial age groups, and maybe that's why we see it more rapidly there, because we see the young workers, the young taxpayers, they're moving out pretty quickly, and the students are moving out. They're not as encumbered as folks with family, but folks with family are also leaving, and it's people who have, on average, higher income than people are moving in.
And so you mentioned the manufacturing sector. Let's talk about that a little bit. The wealth creating sector, a real multiplier sector in terms of wealth creation and economic activity that the service sector is not. And Chicago is like the job shop capital of the world. Once upon a time it was the largest contiguous industrial park in Elk Grove Village around O'Hare Airport being an economic engine for northeastern Illinois. This always being a manufacturing mecca. And even a lot of small to mid-sized manufacturers that I speak with say, I've got job openings to operate a CNC and other digital equipment that we have in our facilities, and it's good. They're good paying jobs. I just don't have the labor pool that I can choose from that fills them so easily. So what's happening with manufacturing in Illinois, which was one of our comparative advantages, in part because of our situation as the transportation hub of the Midwest, as compared to our Midwest neighbors, because I think that starts to tell the story too about economic dynamism.
I think it's both supply and demand. And you were talking about demand for these jobs. We're not training people to have these skills so they could come out and get these very good jobs right out of high school, or maybe you go to a community college for a couple of years. Very, very good jobs, very productive jobs, well-paying jobs. That's not really part of our education system like it was in the past. I think
so Mike Rowe has a point. Mike Rowe of Dirty Jobs,
Yeah.
Discovery Channel, he has a point when he talks about VOTEC, and we put all this emphasis on the only good is to get a 4-year degree, and art history is better than learning how to operate machines in a manufacturing facility. And so this is what we've begotten, but it's not been without consequence. And so this is why we need to rethink VOTEC at least as a part of K through 12 and post-secondary education.
Certainly. I think that college prep is great for folks who are going to college, but I think that we've defaulted too far into the idea of everything should be college prep. Well, the majority of people don't go to college, so what are they going to do after high school? This is something we used to do really well, is to prepare folks for vocations. They'd work in, I worked manufacturing when I was growing up, even though we didn't have it in our school. I worked manufacturing through my high school years. And so I learned on the job some, but we never had in school, and they've certainly moved away from that in the curriculum in Illinois. Some places still have it. So on the demand side, as these manufacturers indicate, they indicated to me as well, we don't have kids coming out with the skills that we want them to have to get some of these jobs. I would argue that moving towards more education freedom, more school choice will allow those types of schools to be created rather than one size fits all, having the government decide what the economy is going to look like, so what kind of training we should have kids do. Also,
you have schools that are centered around VOTEC and in different areas where they can attract enough to make it make sense to operate the school.
Right. The supply side of manufacturing jobs also not good because you have a lot of liabilities associated with expanding your workforce here. Workers' compensation famously now costs you 2, 3, 4 times more here in Illinois than it would in Indiana, Wisconsin, these other states. And so when I've looked at that number and I've said, what if you have 500 steel manufacturers and they're all making about $50,000 a year? What's that look like, Illinois versus Indiana? The difference in 1 year will be a couple $100,000. If you look at how much is that worth over the life of a business, it's worth millions of dollars. So you have one line item of workers' compensation, and you could say to a company, and the government of Indiana says this to companies, that if you move over just on the one line of workers' compensation, your move is going to be worth $2, $3, $5, $6 million just to come across the border. And, you know, I'm not someone who thinks the government should be giving a lot of incentives to move companies, but I think that what Indiana does is very strategic. They basically tell these companies, we'll give you tax incentives to cover the cost of the move, and then once you're here, your balance sheet's going to look a lot better on regulatory
It's just a
items.
cheaper cost of doing business.
Right. So we'll cover the cost to get you over here is what they do a lot, and then grow your workforce here. That's what a lot of people are doing. And when they move, they pick up and move. That's extremely costly. I think that the untold story is the new investment dollars just don't come here. It goes over there, so you don't necessarily see a company picking up and moving. It's just, it never grows here, it goes over there.
Well, and so what are the numbers? Let's do a little compare-contrast again. We were doing compare-contrast on in-migration, out-migration in the Midwest. Since the depth of the Great Recession, what are we talking about in terms of recovery of manufacturing jobs in Illinois versus our neighbors?
It's almost not happened here. We came up, we came down, so on net, since the bottom, we're up about 14,000, 15,000 manufacturing jobs. Michigan's somewhere in the 160,000 range. Indiana's in the 90,000 range. Ohio, 70, 80,000.
And these are aggregate numbers. I mean, despite the fact that Illinois is, twice, 2.5 times the population of these, three times the population of Indiana, but these other states that we're talking about, including Michigan. And with Michigan with bankrupt Detroit in the middle of it.
But they've
160,000 manufacturing jobs there since the bottom of the Great Recession, and 15,000 here.
Yeah.
And that's attributable across the board. There's a lot of kind of talk in the abstract about workers' comp. But what you're saying, it's a supply side problem, it's a demand side problem, it's a cost of doing business problem, regulatory problem across the board.
Anything that the government touches here. So what I think is really important about manufacturing is it's very affected by policy in Illinois, specifically policies like labor policy and property taxes. These are very property-intensive businesses. If you look at manufacturing, property taxes are a big cost. Unemployment insurance, big cost. Workers' comp, worker freedom, right-to-work issues, those are big issues for these guys. So everything that Illinois does wrong hits these guys more than it hits almost any other industry. If you look at finance, trading, things like this, they don't care about workers' comp. I was a trader, I didn't know what workers' comp was. If I got injured, I wouldn't have known how to make a claim. It's not something that affects their business. Workers' comp...
And to be fair, I mean, a paper cut is not the same thing as getting injured working heavy machinery. Right. So, I mean, I want to make this point because I think this gets lost sometimes in the discussion. When we're talking about workers' comp and workers' comp reform, we're not trying to screw the little guy. Nobody's suggesting that somebody that is legitimately injured on the job shouldn't be compensated for that injury and covered, right? It's saying things like, if I get injured as a weekend warrior playing softball and I blow out my knee, that is not a workers' comp injury. I was not injured on the job, therefore I shouldn't be allowed to game the system to pretend that I was.
Right, so there's a big part about no longer gaming the system. Another part is, a good place to start would to say, what would be a good system for this worker's long-term interest? A lot of things we do on the medical side are very much against the well-being of these injured workers. There are very strong financial incentives in our system that lawmakers know about for doctors to give them drugs they don't need that are very harmful drugs, because the doctors could get a lot of money selling these drugs directly to workers. This is happening. This has been studied by Johns Hopkins Medical College. They've looked at it. They say Illinois does this like nobody else does. If you want to make a lot of money, you can give pain-killing steroids on the workers' comp system, because in Illinois, the fee we give for that is 300% of what Medicare would give for the same procedure, for the same type of pain-controlling injection. There are a lot of things we do in our system that are very bad for the worker, and the involvement of trial attorneys, stringing these things out for a long period of time, very bad for the worker. So a good place to start would just say, what would be the best interest of the injured worker, and we would see costs coming down across the board.
That's really interesting. I mean, but this is consistent too. If you think about it holistically, this is the whole kleptocratic Orwellian culture of Illinois. I feast on my neighbor, right? Hey, everybody's running a scam. The whole thing is a scam, so I'm just going to get in line to get mine. And the way I get mine, if I'm maybe a dubiously ethical medical professional, is to do what you just said. Here's how you can make some cash, and maybe make up some cash that you're not getting from the government reimbursing you for the treatment of Medicaid patients, for example, right? So I mean, they take from me here, so I got to take from somebody else there, and it just feeds this kleptocracy where you just have Illinois resident gaming Illinois resident to scratch out their piece of the action.
Yeah, and I've spoken with workers who were on workers' comp. A lot of them had been government employees, and they've described how they immediately were in touch with a trial lawyer. They didn't often have flattering things to say about the lawyer who represented them, but they got to the financial payout. And if you look at people who've gone through the medical system here, a lot of times it doesn't work well for them, because there are too many people who have their interest against getting this worker back on the job quickly. There are too many people who make money, whether it's a small part of the medical community, but it happens. You have the trial bar that makes a lot of money off of injuries. So the problem here is there's too much money to make off of a good worker being injured, and that money is made in ways that don't help that worker get back on the job.
You present perverse incentives and you get perverse outcomes. I mean, I wish we would have the governor and Republican leadership in the General Assembly when they just, the Pavlovian incantation about workers' comp explain it. Make the case. Say, I'm on the side of the worker getting back to 100% as quickly as possible. Here's how the system actually works against that. That's an argument that you hear from no Republican with any title or leadership platform in this state.
It's a system where special interests can make a lot of money off of injuries in the state. Now, there are parts on how we replace wages for workers where we should make changes. For example, some workers go on workers' comp and they make more money than they did when they were working on the job. Again, a perverse incentive should not be in the law, but we have that in the law in Illinois. So there are changes we should make on how we replace the wages for a guy when he's injured and off the job. We shouldn't be giving pay increases. Again, a bad incentive. Why? If you pay me more to stay at home, I'm going to think about staying at home.
Right. I mean, it's just another form of a welfare payment.
Right. And so we do want the incentive for the worker to get back on the job. So you need to make some changes there also. But this is a system where interests get wealthy off of, gaming a government regulation.
You mentioned right-to-work states or worker freedom states, which are the majority of the states in this country. All the states that surround us now that both Missouri and Kentucky have gone right to work. The argument that the unions will make, public sector and private sector unions will make is, well, what you see there in those other states is that those manufacturing jobs that you place such importance on and the working man that you say you're on the side of, well, he gets screwed under right to work and because he's not part of a unit that negotiates wages and benefits. And so this is a way for employers to pay these skilled workers in the manufacturing sector, for example, less than they would make if they were represented by a union. What's the response to that?
Data doesn't support that. If you look at manufacturing jobs in states around us, depending on, there's different data sets, but it's always competitive between Indiana and Illinois. Sometimes Indiana has higher wages after you adjust for cost of living. Michigan also, Texas also. A lot of states have higher manufacturing wages. What gets lost in the conversation about wages here is that Illinois, with the Chicago Center, has a lot of very high-paid corporate-type jobs, finance-type jobs, law jobs, and that pulls up the state average wage. But when you look at blue-collar jobs, Illinois actually pays lower wages for blue-collar jobs when you adjust for cost of living than Indiana does. That's on the average because, the number one thing that's going to drive up wages is when businesses need to compete for workers. This has always been the driver of increased wages, and then worker productivity also going up.
And profitability such that you're in a low tax, low regulation environment where you can run a profitable business and reward those that are productive within the business.
And if you look at the issue of workers' compensation, if workers' compensation costs you, say, 15% of payroll in Illinois and 5% of payroll in Indiana, where's that 10% difference go? That's how you can attract skilled workers out of Illinois. If you just have a more reasonable system in Indiana, the company is, if payroll is payroll, we're going to pay this much for payroll and this much for payroll, the more that government regulations take out of payroll, the less there is for the worker, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, right. And so the skilled blue-collar worker makes less when you factor in cost of living, which is a relevant factor, than their counterpart in Indiana. And yet there's something interesting I understand to be true about Illinois as well in this conversation, which is it's the only state in the Great Lakes that has more government jobs than manufacturing jobs, which is just that's an incredible statement. I mean, people just need to let that kind of wash over them for a second. Everybody concedes the point because it's true. Manufacturing is the wealth-creating sector. And we have government, which doesn't create wealth, it transfers wealth. That is bigger in Illinois than what we all understand to be a wealth-creating sector, and that's not the case in any of our Midwestern neighbors. That's a staggering development, isn't it?
This is the manufacturing center of the country. This is one of the manufacturing centers of the world. And so this region is one of the only regions where you do have more manufacturing than government jobs because other states don't have so much manufacturing. But to the point, it explains Illinois, that we are the one state in the Midwest that has, it's not even close. We have way more government jobs than manufacturing jobs.
And oh, by the way, talking about comparative wages, salaries, we have the highest paid state workers in the nation adjusted for cost of living. We have Chicago public school teachers who have the highest lifetime earnings of any teacher in the nation, any teachers group in the nation adjusted for cost of living. So it turns out we don't just have more in the public sector, we have more, and they're making quite a bit more than their counterparts in other states, all being financed by skilled blue-collar workers and others in the private sector who make less when you do job classification
Right.
public versus private.
And this is why these guys are moving across the border. It's not a good deal for them. Well, that's one of the reasons. There's also just not as much job creation here. Indiana, I thought it was a fantastic headline that we saw come out of Elkhart, Indiana, a couple months ago, where they said, we don't have enough workers here. We have too many jobs.
Yeah.
And I just imagine the marketing campaign that you could run in Illinois if you're some economic developer in Elkhart. And I talked to them, they said that they do. I said, that's a good idea because we have a lot of people who can't find work here. They do it in Illinois, West Virginia, a couple other places. So that's the kind of problem that you want to have as a state. That's the opposite of what we have. We have a sort of an oversupply of underutilized labor, of people who are just unemployed or just partially employed, marginally employed. And these people leave the state. I mean, the best thing for Illinois' unemployment rate is Indiana, Texas, Tennessee. The states where our unemployed move to. So they're no longer counted as unemployed Illinois people. If you didn't have out-migration, Illinois' unemployment rate would be tremendously higher because all these unemployed people are going to get jobs in other states. So Illinois should thank some of these states for driving down our unemployment rate.
Yeah, it's kind of a perverse thank you, but here's the other leg in this stool, of course, when you talk about people being successful independent adults and charting their own course and adding value to their community in addition to their family is K through 12 education, the kind of education they have access to. And this is particularly salient at the moment because we have Grammy Award-winning Chance the Rapper, Pants, the governor of the state of Illinois, make him a national embarrassment for walking into a buzzsaw, taking a meeting with Chance the Rapper to try and get some cheap pandering earned media. And it turns out Chance and Bruce Rauner are not quite on the same page with Bruce Rauner's job performance, and so they had very different takeaways from that meeting where you had the governor of the state be chastised by a 23-year-old rapper who has demonstrated he doesn't have a real appreciation, understanding for what's happening in the Chicago public school system, of which he's a product, although he's a product of the small percentage of the choice element within CPS because he got to go to a selective enrollment high school thanks to his parents' cash and clout, something that a lot of other black and brown families don't have the luxury of with respect to their children, and Chance doesn't seem particularly attuned to that difference. But K through 12 education, you've had some experience that I think is illustrative, both teaching part-time in this city for a time, and then also overseas in Korea.
Yeah, my first job out of college, I was teaching kids in South Korea. And the idea where I was teaching was basically from 5th grade through high school, we wanted to have kids who are ready to go to elite American universities. So we would do...
or the LPGA.
Or that's true. They did need to prepare for that also. So we would have kids who wanted to go to University of Chicago, Harvard, and then all tiers because they did want to get an American education, and they work tremendously hard. They, in some ways, I would say they overwork their kids. They go to school 9 to 9, and I think in some ways they overdo it. But they're hungry, and they're one of the best educated countries in the world. And so it was very stark to me. First time I took the SAT, first time I saw an SAT was the first time I took it. Over there, they've seen the test, 10 times. They've practiced. They've gotten ready. So they're very hungry for education. They want to live like Americans live. They want to move here. A lot of them want to move here. They want to get an education here. So that was a very stark way for me to begin teaching. And then I came back, and I was working in the finance industry here. But at night, I would teach in South Shore from after hours. And what we did there was really the complete opposite of what I was doing in South Korea. So in South Korea, we had a lot of kids whose families were pushing them to get ahead. They were learning in English. They were learning math in English. They were learning, American and English literature. In South Shore, what our normal situation was is we would take in a kid who would be in 9th or 10th grade. his math would be in the first or second grade level. And so we would try within 3, 4, 5 months to get his math up to his grade level. And this was normal. So I saw almost every kid who came in where we taught at night, because I would test them at the beginning. And we would have a test that would be, the first question would be first grade math, then second grade math. And almost universally, kids didn't get past 5th grade math, even though they would be in high school. Most of these kids were in, 8th grade through high school. So clearly, what that told me was kids are not learning these things in school. And what we dealt with, so the place where I taught was all black students, almost all black students. The neighborhood was all black neighborhood. These were the kids whose parents or grandparents put together a couple bucks so that they could get this private education at night. And they were in the second grade level when they were 9th or 10th grade kids. And so that always made me think about the 99% kids that I never saw, who, almost certainly had lower math skills. And it was tough. Like, we would see kids, like, you would wonder, where's this kid going to be in 5 years? And so you would just work and work and work to get them up. And we had very talented teachers working there. But it was so clear that the education system was failing these kids, and they don't have a way out. I don't know much about Chance the Rapper, but I know he went to a good selective school in Chicago.
Jones.
My argument would be, let's have all kids have that option, whether it's Jones or it's some charter school that's going to pop up, a private school that'll pop up. If you give people the choice to opt out of a school, it's not that they have to go to the north side or the suburbs to go to school. You will have schools go to them. Once a school is able to compete and provide an alternative education, you'll have schools open up in the neighborhood. We know that from Teach for America. All these Princeton kids went into a system to go into the worst parts of the inner city. The problem was they were still in the whole union-controlled system in many of these places. If you allow alternative schools, vocational schools to come in and compete, they will. And they will make investments to improve these communities, give these kids a real chance. But right now, I saw like the kids who had some money that they could put towards, a little extra education at night. Most kids I didn't see, I could guess what they're going to be doing the next couple of years, but it's not a pretty outcome. So the opportunity, I think, that was missed with this Chance the Rapper situation was the opportunity to really take the moral high ground and fight the real fight, which is kids and families should be allowed to get out of the situation, get out of the system. In South Korea, where I first taught, 90% of kids get private education after hours. 90% of kids do that for math, and something like 60, 70% for English. If you allowed people out of the system, you would see them doing alternative forms of education. Competition would raise the quality up. You would see kids getting out of the system or getting skills to go get a manufacturing job right out of high school, or these types of jobs. But we just don't allow that. I think that that's really one of the most outrageous things we do as a state, is not allow people out of a system like that.
And it just seems that there's everything as the kind of uncritical celebration of Chance the Rapper's $1 million donation to CPS highlights, is we don't care about outcomes. We care about inputs. Somebody's throwing $1 million at CPS, then we should celebrate that. Well, I remember 22, 23 years ago now, Walter Annenberg's foundation threw $50 million at CPS, and it was a match. That's $93, $94. And if somebody could give me an accounting of where that $50 million went, I'd be really interested to see it, because I have no idea. And I don't think CPS does either. CPS doesn't have any idea where most of their money goes for this budget year, much less what happened when you had outside investment to say, I want to do something. I appreciate the instinct, but as someone said about the road to hell and good intentions. And so it seems to me we should look and say, well, to challenge Chance rather than pander to him and say, why don't you do whatever you want, it's your cash. But if you want to actually improve the lives of some students, rather than sending 10 grand to some elementary school where not a single kid in that school passed Algebra 1, and even citywide, as bad as CPS, 18% pass Algebra 1 by the time they get out of grade school. Why don't you do something to fund scholarships for kids whose father didn't work for Rahm Emanuel? and couldn't go to a selective enrollment school. Why don't we have that conversation? And it's the frustrating thing is the fear that grips people who know better from saying better because of what? Because they don't want to be called uncool by Chance the Rapper, or because they don't want to be called a racist, or they don't want to be demagogued by Tiny Dancer or Karen Lewis or Tiny Dancer's Toady Forrest that pretends to run CPS. I mean, that's the frustrating thing, and it just seems to me, going back to the overarching question that comes back and back as we talk about all these different sectors at Illinois, boy, again, make the case for me to stay.
And I mean, and on education, the question should be asked, what number do you need to see on funding? Because right now, you know, Illinois has higher per pupil education funding than any states around us. And the results, depending on your area, can be quite bad in Illinois. So what number do you need to see?
Right, it's north of 15 grand per pupil in Chicago, which is higher than most of the suburban school districts. Certainly where I grew up, a good suburban school district, public school district, I didn't attend. But Wheaton, Warrenville South, they don't spend $15,200 per kid. They got 100% going to college and all that jazz. So I've said that before too. You can't outspend me on education if you connect it to outputs.
Right.
If you tell me that at Dan it needs to be 30 grand per kid, then let's make it 30. And you're gonna have the performance of Wheaton, Warrenville South in high schools throughout Chicago. Let's spend 30 grand per kid. Is it 45? Let's spend 45.
Right.
But they don't have a number. They just have a rationalization for failure, and they continue to provide it because we continue to accept it.
If you have a real outcome, then you could look at it in terms of, you know, this is an investment in. We all want kids in all neighborhoods to get a good education. What I think burns a lot of people, and I am a property owner in Chicago, I see the property tax go up, and I worked on the south side. I know the educational outcomes are not going up, especially in communities where you don't have the charter school. I mean, after I worked that job for a couple years, and then I started volunteering on a charter school board. It's the only virtual school, it's the only virtual charter school in the city because there was a state law saying that you could not have more than one after they had this one. And what struck me on that one was I was serving on the board, so the education provider, which was a private for-profit company, I thought, you know, we're going to have to drill these guys, hold their feet to the fire, make sure they're getting it done. And that was the job of the board. But when I talked to parents about why you come here, a lot, like you would get these stories, like one of the kids was actually an actor, so he was in, you know, LA some of the time. But one of the stories that I heard the most was, I'm in a virtual high school because I don't want to walk to school. I don't want to dodge bullets.
Why do we have safe passage routes? Because they're unsafe.
And so the idea that they capped this safety valve, because the question in my mind was always, a charter school needs to make sure it's adding value more than the alternative. That question became a lot easier for me to deal with when I realized that we had kids who were afraid to walk out of their house. So I was like, well, they could get their education at home. There's sort of a homeschooling element. They're getting the online education. So that was a lot easier for me to deal with. But then the moral question of how do we let people live through this?
Right.
How do we have people walk through some degree of war zone? And I used to work in one of these areas in South Shore and say this is how an education should be done, and then have them go to a school where the results just aren't there. And it's not just that they didn't take Algebra 1, and you made that point. I would see kids who had taken Algebra 1, geometry, trigonometry, and then when I would give them a test, they would be in second grade math.
Yeah.
So they couldn't do, you know, sign all these different things. That was sort of Greek to them. But what their parents would all express shock, because they would say, my kid got an A- in geometry. My kid got a B+ in trig. And I'd say, this is the test, this is a trig question, this is a geometry question. This is a third grade multiplication question. And they'd be getting them all wrong. And so it's not just the kids don't take some of these advanced classes, it's that we don't have real grades, was my experience, is these kids are getting A's and B's. And they're getting A's and B's, and then they got 14s on their ACTs.
Right.
This would be a kid I would see all the time.
Yeah, it's gaming the stats by the politicians effectively that are in charge of the system, and then it creates a culture where you scam the system because the system is a scam. So what's one more scam? And with respect to charter schools, it's my contention that that's really a way station of real choice. I know that charter schools are more palatable to some who are uncomfortable with real school choice opportunity scholarships, like, I don't know, 24 states have, not named Illinois. But they're still publicly funded schools. You see the possibility of a strike with staff in charter schools at present in Chicago. They still are subject to, the vagaries of the public sector unions, the teachers union in particular. And so that's a positive innovation, anything that expands choice and options. But that can't be the end of the story if you want real competition that improves the quality of the product and lowers the cost.
My vision would be an open field of competition, because I think you would see tremendous investment dollars coming in. Some of it for profit, some of it nonprofit. And if the $15,000 that you're saying goes to the family instead of to the system, then you could have a system where, I'll run a private school and the tuition's going to be $8,000. The other $7,000, you could put that towards tutoring. You could put that towards college savings, education savings accounts. Right. You make the families owners of the education rather than just sort of people who are beholden to an interest that controls the system. And that's what I think you need to move towards in education, is a system where families and students are owners of their own education and have avenues to opt out of what they're currently getting. And you could see a situation where you could have, like a manufacturing group partnering with, a traditional education group, and we're going to create the vocational manufacturing high school. So we're going to get the English, the math, and all those things, and then we're going to have the best manufacturing curriculum that you can get. So you could have these interesting combinations that would occur. You could have it for finance, for coding, for tech jobs, all these different things. You could have these combinations if you allowed more freedom. I think the problem right now is it's almost a dream, because that type of freedom and dynamism would be so attractive to families. If you could run a manufacturing high school where you'd say, if you bring your kid here, 2 years from now, he's got a good job. Just think of the flow of families that would go towards that. Just think of the attraction that certain communities that don't have job opportunities, if they'd, because that's how I'd sell my school. I'd say, if you come to my school, you're going to have a job in 2 years, whether it's manufacturing or you're going to be going to college. If you could do that, and if people had to compete to be able to do that because parents had a choice, then you would see real outcomes and real change. We're not there right now, for sure. And some of the strongest interests in the state would prefer we never get there.
Yeah, clearly. And so we've covered a lot of ground, addressed a lot of fallacies about a lot of topic areas, policy, and just kind of the dynamics of what's the reality on the ground in Chicago and Illinois. If you could kind of snap your fingers and debunk one myth that pervades the minds of a majority of Illinoisans, that would get them to have kind of a collective epiphany overnight and understand something that they have demonstrated through their behavior on election days that they don't understand, what would that myth be?
One myth, it would be hard to do because there are a lot that I would want to get to. I would say that the interests that currently control Springfield are not looking out for your long-term interests. So it's often presented in the media that this guy is doing this and this guy is doing that, and then they sort of buy the rhetoric. Like, we're doing this for the middle class. We want middle class wages to go up, and we want middle class job opportunity to go up. Well, if you look at the track record of the people who say these things, I mean, it's completely absurd. We've got a speaker who talks about wanting wages to rise, and he says that the governor is going to try to knock down wages. He has no data that can support what he's saying, but they're able to get away with it. So I think that would be the one myth I would want to take on, is the myth of sort of this progressive policy agenda being good for the middle class.
Well, now, to be fair, Madigan's only had 3 decades, so he's kind of still in that probationary period. We don't know how it's going to turn out with respect to his record. No, I think that's a good one. And Mike Lucci, who's Vice President of Policy at the Illinois Policy Institute, is debunking myths one at a time, one day at a time, saving one starfish at a time in this state, and doing a great job. Michael Lucci, Vice President Policy, Illinois Policy Institute. Thanks for joining us on this edition of Against the Current. Appreciate it.
Thank you for having me on.